Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, to Discovery Dialogue with radio personality Rob Simone. This is the first in what is planned to be an ongoing series. Tonight's disclosure features Dr. Dan Burisch. Dr. Burisch is an Area 51 insider, deep inside, who has worked with live ETs and so much, much, much more. Here is Disclosure Dialogue with Rob Simone.
Can you all hear me out there? Well, can you guys hear me out there?
Almost.
They can hear you. No. Okay, you guys can hear me? Hopefully they'll get it straightened out in the back. I know, I have no sound. Nothing I can do. I'm sorry.
I can relay.
You can relay.
Sure.
Well, okay,
all right.
We're coming into it now. Thank you all for coming. This is the first installment of Disclosure Dialogue. And I can think of no better person to begin this series. Sorry about that. I can think of no better person to begin this series with than our first guest here today. Dr. Dan Burisch represents, in many ways, the solution and the problem to this vast conundrum of our place in a larger universe. And what I mean by that is his story, once you go through it, you realize that it does hold the answers to many of the questions that we have been asking in this field for the better part of 50 years. But it also represents some difficult truths and some very radical, extremely radical changes in the way we're going to turn the sound up in a Yeah, they're fixing the problem. I do apologize if it sounds, we will fix it momentarily. But Dan's particular situation runs not only through where we are or what we plan to do as far as waking up to this truth about our place in the universe. It also goes into the nature of time itself. And when you start diving into this field, you realize that you can't come to this realization of where we are and how we got here without looking at the very nature of time, space itself. So it is with that I want to welcome once again Dr. Dan Burisch.
Thank you.
Dan, I want to first ask you, are you here on your own free will?
Absolutely. I don't do anything unless it is by my absolute free will.
But
that doesn't say that I'm not willing, that I'm willing to say certain things that I've been told not to say.
But that always hasn't been the case, has it? I mean, there was a time when you were immersed in this black program, in this Area 51, that you were scrutinized, monitored, and even censored.
Monitored, censored, imprisoned, and beaten. Yes, sir.
Yeah. There is some extraordinary components to this, and I'd just like to take it back so that people can get a sense of who you were before you got rolled into this extraordinary experience. Who was Dr. Dan Burisch, say, 40 years ago, and under what name were you going into that?
Well, 40 years ago, I was under the name Dan Crane, Danny B. Crane, and who I was is the same person I am now. As I've said a number of times, you can call me about whatever you want as long as I'm not, called late for dinner. I grew up in Southern California. I was born in the Los Angeles area, and when the rolling up, so to speak, as you put it, began to occur, this was in 1973. I was a young boy playing baseball in Mayboyer Park in Lakewood, California with my grandfather, and I had a very unusual experience in the park. that unusual experience resulted, I think, in a chain of events which ultimately led me to being approached at University of Nevada at Las Vegas in 1986.
And this unusual event was not just catching a fly ball.
No.
This was your first encounter or experience with entities beyond the human race.
Well, what happened was I was out on a bright day with my grandfather, and we were playing catch. I wanted to catch a ball like Willie Mays, so I told him to throw it high, and I ran, and the ball went over my head. And I looked up toward the ball, and I remember seeing a flash of the sun. And so I winced, and I looked down for a moment at the grass below me. And then I noticed that the entire area around me turned black. It had been shaded out from the sun. The next thing I consciously remember was noticing that the sun itself was in a different position. I was still standing on the ball field. And I looked to the west where my grandfather was then seated by a tree. And I remember it was almost like a single frame flash of a tall person standing behind my grandfather. The tall person was wearing, it appeared to be all gray.
All right.
And aside from that, I didn't see anything, unusual or entities or anything like that.
Okay.
I then ran toward my grandfather, and he just stayed seated at the tree, which was very unusual for him. Mm-hmm. Am I still hearable?
Yeah.
Great,
yeah.
Great. No feedback now. Following that, he said to me he just wanted to take me home. He had reddened eyes. He had been crying, and which was very unusual for me because I had never seen my grandpa cry. Right. And he walked me home that day, and that began a series of events in my family, which ultimately resulted in my grandfather and my grandmother moving away. We were an extended family. Mm-hmm. Late night arguments between my grandfather, my grandmother, and my parents. Him not wanting to talk about, and to the day he finally passed away, he would never speak about the events in the park that day. Some 30 years after that occurred, the grown-up boy, now a man, was taken back by Marcia, who's here in the audience, to May Boyer Park for the first time, to the south side of Del Amo Boulevard. Mm-hmm. And for the first time, I re-experienced the emotions of that day. Mm-hmm. She actually captured it on film, and as part of the private portions of my debriefing from the years with Madge, mm-hmm. that she filmed that first moment of return back there, and I think she plans on releasing it at some time. Mm-hmm. A lot of tears, a lot of emotion. I could feel my grandpa for the first time after that many years. I could see him sitting there, and I knew that he was still with me.
Mm. Well, you are best known for your expertise in microbiology, and it is for that skill that you were brought into this very deep, dark, black world. When did you first start your interest in biology or science in general?
That started after what I found out much later was in fact an abduction experience at May Boyer Park. Mm-hmm. That started within the next couple of years after that. I didn't have any interest in science. I wanted to play baseball. I wanted to play with my G.I. Joes, my Planet of the Apes figurines, and I was just what I considered a normal kid. I wanted to ride my bike and all of that, but within a couple of years after that experience, and after Grandma and Grandpa moved away, and we moved to another apartment complex from the house that we lived on Stevely at the time. My interests began to change. They began to change rapidly. The Planet of the Apes figurines and the G.I. Joes were given over for beakers, and I had had a Tasco microscope ever since I was way young. And I started looking through the Tasco microscope more. And then something happened with my mom, Dodie. She said that she knew that I had a greater interest in science, and that she had been approached by a gentleman who suggested to have me introduced to a pathologist. she didn't really tell me anything much about that approach. I found out years later, because of a conversation that she subsequently had with Marcia, that she was actually given some money by these gentlemen and suggested who to call the chief pathologist at Long Beach Memorial Medical Center, and that he would help us from there. She called, and I was fairly quickly introduced to Dr. James Reynolds, a pathologist at Long Beach Memorial Medical Center. In fact, he was the chief pathologist there at the time. Kind of took me under his wing and showed me some histology slides and found that I had a certain aptitude. Where the aptitude came from, I still don't know for sure. I have my suspicions. But the aptitude was not normal for what I considered the young boy at the time.
Your age bracket.
Right.
Yeah.
I began picking up the histopathological slides and working through them one after another, and was remembering all of the names of the cells and could rattle them off for him and the tissue layers fairly quickly. We were working with a double-headed AO scope there in the pathology lab. And I was taken for many, many weekends on Saturdays, and he showed me how to process tissues and do paraffin sections and all of that. So the interest picked up rapidly, and he said, well, you don't have a decent microscope. You've got that plastic toy. Let me introduce you to a man named John DeHaas. So he introduced me from there to the DeHaas optical person, who was also an associate professor at USC. Dr. DeHaas was a fairly elderly German gentleman, spoke with a heavy accent. And he said, he says, we've got a little meeting, and I'd like to introduce you to some people at the Los Angeles Microscopical Society. And we meet at the George C. Page Museum at the La Brea Tar Pits.
I'm sure they're a fun bunch.
They're all right. I mean, I walked into a group of people that I consider the most learned minds in the world, especially at the time. And they knew everything about microscopes, and they were interested in the same things I was interested in. So it was like literally a kid in a candy shop.
So you found your circles, and you started to thrive.
Well, they found me. The circles found me, because I was just kind of moving from then living on Delamo Boulevard, further down Delamo, then to meeting Dr. Reynolds, then to John DeHaas, then to the leader of the Lambs, Gil Millay, who was a composer. He passed away a few years ago, and also a microscope enthusiast. He had a house full of old brass scopes, just beautiful things. From there, Zane Price from UCLA, who I believe is in emeritus now, the gentleman who showed me how to use a transmission scope for the first time, an electron microscope.
Did you start your formal education at SUNY, I believe, before you got sort of indoctrinated into this intelligence work, or
No.
was this something that happened after?
No, what happened was I was working in Bert's lab, Dr. Bert Bell Barbero. I'm not sure if he's still around. God, I hope so. But working in Bert Barbero's lab, under cover of secrecy in the department, because I had already been made persona non grata, I refused to change certain numbers having to do with a hypochlorite study that I was doing with another professor. He wanted me to up some numbers so that higher funding would come in from the National Cancer Institute. I said no. I gave him the set of keys and the keys accessing the White Hall's Animal Laboratory, and said, thank you, no. As a result of that, I lost any opportunity for a committee letter to go to medical school. However, Bert, who needed somebody to clean his laboratory, offered me in exchange for my willingness to clean his histology and his parasitology, there were connected labs, offered me the opportunity to continue the work inside of his laboratory.
Okay.
So there I was working one day in 1986.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, to Discovery Dialogue with radio personality Rob Simone. And so much, much, much more. Here is Disclosure Dialogue with Rob Simone. This is the first in what is planned to be an ongoing series. Tonight's disclosure features Dr. Dan Burisch. Dr. Burisch is an Area 51 insider, deep inside, who has worked with live ETs.
Can you all hear me out there? Well, can you guys hear me out there?
Almost.
They can hear you. No. Okay, you guys can hear me? Hopefully they'll get it straightened out in the back. I know I have